We don't go there. If something is difficult, we bury it, we push it aside, we numb it with whatever it is, our chosen numbing agent. Is it that grief becomes complex, or the fact that grief is woven into so many aspects of our lives?
The loss of the sort of dominant role of mother, how we used to look, our bodies changing, to have compassion for ourselves that says, you know what, the fact that I am feeling a loss and experiencing grief is the thing that asks for my self-compassion. It doesn't ask for my judgment.
Welcome to Midlife Unfiltered, a podcast about unapologetically embracing the season of me as we live the lives we want in midlife and beyond. I'm Anita McLachlan.
I'm Webb. We're here to make some noise, say hell no to outdated stereotypes, and hell yes to living life on our terms.
In our previous episodes, we spoke about death and chatted with end-of-life doula Jackie Williams. Today we're speaking about a closely related topic to death, which is often one that's thought mainly exclusively around death, and that is grief. But grief is not felt or experienced exclusively with death.
No, grief is so much more than that. And so often we will experience grief in times of change, in times of transition, anytime that there is a loss of any kind, not just the loss through loss of life.
Loss, that's the big thing. And when we were wanting to explore this topic, Erica, that's something that I must admit I never really looked at it in that context before, because if you'd said to me grief, I would have gone straight to death. 100%. That's where my thoughts would have gone. But as a woman in the midst of mega change, on all fronts of my life, I can now appreciate looking through the lens of loss and see how that is what I'm feeling is loss on different fronts, but also that it is grief that I need to deal with or I need to process in all of that. So I think this is a really important topic, and I'm really looking forward to exploring it further with you and, with our listeners too. So, yeah, yeah, it's a big one. It's a big one.
It is a big one, and I think it comes up a lot more than we think. Like you said, your first thought was immediately death, but it is often part of any kind of reorganization of our identity and of our life. There will be a sense of grief within that because, sometimes it's a perceived lost opportunity, a change in relationship, kids growing up, parents aging, changes in careers, change in relationships. All of these things lead to grief because there is inevitably a loss of some sort, a change of some sort. So, yes, I think this is going to be a really important conversation because it's something that absolutely none of us can avoid.
No, that's very, very true. I was doing some research around this, and Claire Bidwell Smith, I found her through listening to Jonathan Fields have a conversation with her from the Good Life Project. And Jonathan, if you're listening, thank you so much. The conversations that he has on Good Life Project are amazing. And so Claire was on talking about grief. She's written like 5 books on the subject, and this is her specialty because she lost both of her parents by the time she was 25, and both of them to cancer, 2 different experiences. But she says, and I'd like to quote this to get it right, "The more I leaned into my grief, the more I acknowledged and accepted it, the better able I was to cope with it." So often we don't go there. If something is difficult, we bury it, we push it aside, we numb it with whatever it is our chosen numbing agent. But what she is saying is that there is light to the dark, that through leaning into her grief, she was able to cope with it better. And I think that's a really important aspect to this whole experience of grief. And again, not something that I would have immediately thought of, that I just would go to dark. Like, this is dark, this is a dark place, but there is the light with the dark. And
Mm.
maybe that's the unexpected beauty of grief. Unexpected beauty? What do you
Mm.
think?
Yeah. Oh, what do I think? I think that when we talk about unexpected beauty and grief in the same sentence, it feels a little jarring, and yet I think it's completely true. And I think it speaks to the fact that life is never as simple as it appears, as we'd like it to be on the surface, that grief coexists with all the other emotions as well. But it makes me think of the fact that if we aren't willing to acknowledge something, it doesn't just go away because we chose to ignore it. So I guess what I hear in that quote is that truth that I think covers off most human experiences, that what we are able to acknowledge, we're able to move through. But if we're not willing to, and not even through, not like there's somewhere to go, not that there's some way to get rid of it, but we can be present to it without as much fear, because we're kind of like, you know, saying, okay, yes, let's look at this. Yeah, I think that's important. It's just that acknowledgement piece of, here is what I'm experiencing. Can I be with myself compassionately in that?
Yeah. Yeah, compassionately, and we'll come back to that. I think that's a big part of this, self-compassion, and also compassion with others. She also, talks about a common myth around grief, in that it's a one and done. You maybe deal with it, not deal with it. It's gonna just be 6 months, maybe a year, and, then you'll push on through and you'll get on with your life, and there it is. It's a neat little package. We bundle up and we put it in the post, and then we get on with our life. And she just says that grief is so not that. Grief is very much, it takes time, and it will take time for us each individually. We'll have our own time frame of dealing with death, and maybe it lasts a lifetime. It's not a
Mm.
one and done quick thing to get over or through, as you say. And I think that's another really important um, part of this conversation, is to know that you are not doing it wrong if you're not over your feelings of grief by a certain time. I should be through this by now, but I'm not, because it's just
Mhm.
doesn't work that way.
No, there's a beautiful, I wish I could credit the artist. There's a beautiful thing that I've seen in online somewhere that kind of debunks that myth of, that grief kind of gets smaller over time. And there's this visual that goes with it, that it's like, no, I just expanded around it in order to hold it with more grace. And I think that, if I can find a link to that image, we'll put it in the show notes, because it is a really beautiful way, I think, to consider that. I think it's a complete disservice to the human spirit to believe that we do just at some point get over and move on. It's like, but what if things just shift and change in the presence of that grief, and we are forever different, and the way that we see the world is forever different, and that's okay. And, there will be moments where the grief just overtakes a person, whether it's a grief over a loss of life or grief over lost relationships or anything else. We don't control the way that that might bubble up. But perhaps the willingness to be with it takes the scariness out of those emotional waves, perhaps.
Mm. That's powerful. That's really powerful. That hit right here when you were describing that. I think that's a really good, I'm struggling to find the word. I think it's a not even a concept, because that makes it sound like a science experiment, but
Mm.
it's a lovely way of thinking about it, and that whole notion of sitting with it and is an as it envelopes you but not strangles you at times. I'm sure it feels that way, but yeah, it's almost like it's just becomes a part. You are a part of it, and the two
Mhm.
are together. Yeah, yeah, I
Mm.
love that. Thank you. I look forward to seeing that. Yeah.
Yes, I'll make sure I find it. I think one of the other things that pops up when you said that, Anita, was also I think when we're in the depths of something, it feels like it will never be any other way.
Mm,
Like when you're having a bad day for whatever reason, whether it's grief or something else, we can be tricked into thinking that that's it now. This is just my baseline. This is just how I feel. And I think grief can be like that too. When we're really in the hard yards of it, it can feel like there will be no more joy. There will be no more happiness. There will be no more pleasure. And then a little glimmer of one of those things pops up and it's like, oh, it's, nothing is always going to stay exactly the same. But that doesn't mean that it's this linear progression towards the grief diminishing and the joy increasing. But perhaps they kind of ebb and flow
mm,
endlessly. um,
mm,
and knowing that that's the case perhaps makes it a little easier to sit with too, because we know that, okay, this isn't going to disappear, but it's also not a steady state emotion forever.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And now I'm thinking of, like the 5 stages of grief framework that has been around for
Mm.
quite some time now. I think I've got here in my notes since 1969, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross described 5 common stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I think it's served a really good purpose, because we all love a framework, right? Because that helps us to grab onto something in the dark. If I can just follow this framework, it gives us a map, a way forward, through the messiness. Um, but Claire talked about this with Jonathan, and she just said in her experience, that it's not this linear progression, to your point. It's something that it's almost like a dance where, you move forward, you move back, you move sideways, and it's not that you then, once you have been through denial, then comes anger. It's not that. You might have denial and then anger shows up, but then denial comes back and then acceptance comes in just very briefly. And then, I don't know, maybe denial comes back again. So it's
Yeah.
kind of like this. Yeah. Yeah. So I thought that was a really interesting take on it as well, because I think that framework's been around for a long time. It's certainly something that I've seen before. Not that I've ever
Mhm.
really used it, but I'm aware of it. Maybe our listeners have as well.
And it very much speaks to our human desire for things to be tidy like that, and for there to be
Yeah.
a path that we can follow and to know, am I close yet? Am I nearly there? Am I hot? Am I cold? Where am I, going? And
Mm,
it's like, what if there is no none of that? That's a scary thought too. So I think frameworks like that can help us to feel a little contained perhaps in our experiences. But then, yeah, you're right. When it doesn't follow the rules of that framework, where are we left? And we're often
and
left feeling kind of crappy, right?
yeah, and what does that
On
say
top of a
about us,
grief that already felt bad.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and now
yeah,
I'm failing. Not only am I
can't even
grieving,
grieve
I'm
properly.
failing. Yeah, that's right, exactly. You and I have a lot in common, and one of the reasons why we wanted to focus on grief, as a topic, was because, each of us has a parent with dementia and advanced dementia. My dad, um, has stage 4. He's got frontotemporal, dementia, and your mum, uh,
Also has
is quite
frontotemporal.
advanced.
I don't think I knew that.
No, I didn't. Wow. No, we've not
Yeah,
actually
mum's
spoken
also
about the type
frontotemporal
of
dementia.
Wow. Okay, you and I can talk about that,
Hmm.
as well offline now, but, because that's a rarer form
Mhm.
of dementia, and particularly for women. Um, and both of them, I mean, dad's 80. Oh, what is dad? I'm 57, Tanya's 53, so dad's 83. Is that's how I do the maths to find out, I remember. So dad's 83. How old's your mum?
My mum's 73.
73,
73 turning
right.
74. No, 72 turning 73.
Mm. And I think that form of dementia is typically, one that's for younger people as well. It's rarer to be, um,
Mhm.
it later in life experience it. But so with dementia, man, they call it the slow goodbye, and I could not agree with that, statement anymore. It is it's a tortuous journey with lots of different emotions, and I think watching watching my dad slowly will change, different ways through this dementia journey. Um, that has been a slow loss, and we don't know how much longer, he's going to be here, with that. But watching him change, and then watching how mum has changed, it's been
Mhm.
really hard. Mm, been really hard. Mm.
Torturous is the right word. And I don't know what your experiences were like with your dad, but what I can say about my experiences with my mum from this point of grief and loss was that before we knew what was wrong with mum, there was a loss of our relationship because the early signs of dementia for mum were very personality change based. She didn't want to talk to us. She wasn't kind in the way that she was in the past. She was fairly short with us and fairly dismissive. And so in the time where that was happening, there was a complete shift in our relationship, which
Yeah.
was a sort of loss at the time that then kind of created this on-ramp to a whole other set of losses and grief. And so there's like this long goodbye, and I think what is also cruel about it is it's a goodbye that you start to say before you even know what's happening. That was my experience. Was that there
Mm.
was this sense that, oh, I lost a lot before I even knew that something was happening, that something was changing. And it's, my mum can't speak. So she lost language really early. And so there's also a loss of, like, there's this whole sense of like we've just lost a person and we've been left with remnants of that.
Mm.
Yeah. I don't know what else I want to say, but it's like, it's just cruel on so many levels.
It's a multi-layered loss, isn't it? So it's your looking at them and your relationship with them and who they are, their identity, this person that you've known all of your life is now so very different. And it's not their choice,
Mhm.
right? It's not how they would choose to be. Um, and then you can see how it affects those you love. And there's the loss that you see in others. And that's where it gets even deeper in terms of loss
Mhm.
and grief. That's what I find. And that's different for all of us. Um, Thankfully, dad is still a happy soul, like
Mm.
that's the amazing thing. Um, we're fortunate in that he's pretty happy, but he's
Hmm.
got more physical issues as well as, loss of understanding
Mm.
and, memory recall and things like that.
Yes.
It's a physical loss. He's finding it hard to do things and increasingly can't do things by himself.
Mm.
So I think watching Mum and how she has handled this loss or processing this loss, I find that equally as difficult in many
Mhm.
in many ways.
Yeah. Yes, I completely agree. My dad cared for Mum until the time that she had to move into an aged care home. And that I've been so lucky to have a model of love from my parents that is,
Yeah,
unmatched. They adored each other. And dad still adores Mum and just treats her with the utmost respect, and to watch that play out is heartbreaking, to see that loss. And there's something about watching that love endure that, you know,
yeah. Is that
it
the
it's
light?
it's amazing. Yeah, that's the light. That's the light.
That
Yeah,
could be the light. Yeah.
yeah,
We need
yeah.
to look for light, right?
Mhm,
We need to
absolutely,
look for the
and
light.
look for the light, not to necessarily make the darkness disappear, but just to create some illumination within it, you know? It's like having a nightlight. It doesn't make the darkness go away, but at least you've
No.
got a sense of the presence of both. What do you think? Well, I wonder if I can term this question. Your dad's still at home, isn't he, with Mum?
So far. Yeah, so
Mm.
far.
Because then there's the loss of what could have been too, right? Like, I think of that often in terms of this loss of possibility, the loss of relationships that could have been had, memories that could have been made. You know, the illness sort of takes away the possibility of traveling together with them,
Mhm,
of
mm,
sharing those retirement moments, those, there's all these things that are just off the table.
mm,
Do you
mm.
think that your mum is experiencing an element of that as well as the loss of this person that she's loved?
Oh, absolutely. I think a mum, in thinking about her journey, and Mum, I hope I do this justice, um, I've seen her go from shame, really deep in shame, um, not only for, uh, responding to the change in behaviour in Dad and the shame that that brought on. There's a lot of
Mhm,
shame in that change because 'cause they're a totally different person. Um, and then also, I've not done enough? Blaming herself, "I could have done more, I should have done more. How can I make this better?" And I'm not yeah, she felt like she was never ever doing enough to help him. And again, that incredible love, you know? Um, and now I think it's moved more often into then it morphed more into guilt. It became less about her in shame and more about, the actions of, am I doing enough? Not because I'm a bad person, but can I be doing enough for him in this moment? Do you know what I mean? Like, and then
mhm,
she's brilliant. She's rallied so much help, which she absolutely needs. Um, and so I see that change, once she understood that she couldn't do it alone, that she needed help from others, switched that um, deep anguish with the sadness and the shame to more of a guilt. And I'll take guilt
mm,
over shame any day. Um,
hmm,
and then now she's starting to detach a little bit more. I think, she's getting more. I think she's getting herself ready for the next transition, which is to, Dad will need care that she can't give him at home because it will be full on, extraordinarily hands on, for everything.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, there's all of that. So I've seen the change in, her journey in dealing with the grief, um, with this, big loss in her life. And then for us, it's as siblings is how do we support her as well as Dad? There's this dance in all of that too, because we want to do right by both of them. And then that brings up different feelings and what we can do. So yeah, it's been a heady mix of a lot of different
Mm.
things. And we know we've still got, well, we think we do. We don't know. Nobody knows for sure, but we think we've still got, some heavy stuff ahead of us. But I'm grateful that Mum has found a way to get some breaks, to feel more alive again, like her. Now she's talking of traveling, again, whereas I don't think that that would have even entered her mind 2 years ago. This has been probably,
Mm.
I don't know, maybe 4 years. Yeah, 3 years.
Mm.
So, yeah, um, is that, yeah, I don't know what else to say. I think that's pretty much it.
Mm. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, that's it, but it's everything, right? Like, there's just so much in there that perhaps is unexplainable and like, there's not a lot of ways to find the words to express what that's like. I find myself sometimes just in the oddest moments thinking, gosh, I miss my mum.
Yeah.
And and yet there's also, I know for me, a wall between me and my grief, for sure. There's only so much I'm willing to
Mhm.
tip my toe in there. Um, yeah, it's a funny experience. Not funny, haha. Like, just it's so unusual. It's so hard to. I find it's the hardest thing I've ever navigated, for sure.
Oh, me
Um,
too. Without a doubt. Without a doubt.
mm,
Mm.
and the grief of, gosh, I look at my kids and yeah, I just don't even know how to explain any of it to them, really. And they've seen it all, they've heard it all, they've been privy to the
Mm.
processing that I've done as well. And it's the loss for them too, the loss of a relationship that they don't get to have, and the losses that result from what I've needed to do and experience in that process, and what that's taken me away from. And yeah, it's so multi-layered.
It is. Yeah, it
Mm.
is. I think, and then you add that into the mix of being in midlife where
Mm.
there's, it really is, um, it's a big part of dealing with yet another big change, you know, that dealing with or processing and helping out and being a part of dementia world, with someone you love, as well as, like for me, the kids being more independent. So my identity there has shifted and changed. Even within my business, doing things very differently and deliberately. So this comes at a time when there is already enormous change in
Mm.
in my life. And I've heard, that the the term sandwich generation, that we're feeling it in both,
Mm.
areas. But I don't know. I don't know that I really buy into that so much because, I had my kids later in life. I was, mid to late 30s. Um, so yes, you could say that that's why it's hitting now with my parents in their 80s, but well, mum's not, but dad is. Um, But I also think we're living longer. So I think what happens is just that whole thing slides across. You know,
Mm,
like my parents had us very young, younger than what I had my kids, but then their parents weren't they didn't live as long either. You know, they died in their
it's
late
true.
60s, early 70s. So I don't know that it's just our generation. I think that we've just slid the whole thing along a bit in terms of age. Um, I don't
Yeah,
know.
I've never really
Anyway.
thought about that. Yeah, I've never considered that, but I will say that I've certainly had moments of real anger, I guess, and frustration that I have had to face
Mm,
what does feel like two ends of a spectrum. You know, I'm
mm,
at the stage still with my kids where I really like the grandparents to be around for help and support and asking questions. And it feels unreasonable to me that I have a parent in an aged care home. It doesn't seem right. It doesn't compute. It wasn't that, that wasn't what was supposed to happen.
that wasn't the
So
plan.
I also, can appreciate, I guess, that notion of I wouldn't necessarily, it's a generational thing, but I definitely feel like there is that sense of that's not how that's supposed to go, you know? I shouldn't still be thinking about raising young children and, you know,
Mm,
managing aging parents. That doesn't seem fair. But that is also just what it is. But I think that comes back to this notion of grief not just being about death, because she's still here. I mean, she's
mhm.
not. Her body is. She's
She's
not
not,
here.
but her body's here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm,
And like in the conversation that we've had, and I feel like I've kind of spoken in a fairly disjointed way, but I think it speaks to the fact that that grief is so embedded in different places. And I think that maybe is why it pops up so unexpectedly, because it's those moments where you're doing something and you think, they should have been here, or they could have been here, or this could have been different, or that could have been different, or why is this, feel hard? If I had that, maybe it would be. So it's like, that can be attached to a life, it can be attached to a role, it can be attached to an expectation. And that's why I think grief becomes so complex. Yeah.
Is it that grief becomes complex or the fact that grief is woven into so many aspects of our lives as it's a evolution of loss and growth?
Ooh, yeah. Mm, I need to chew on that one, but that feels true.
Yeah, because I think I don't know that you get wholesale growth without the loss.
Mm.
Um, but like we've talked about, it's multi-layered, right? So, um, yeah,
And I
growth
wonder
is
if there's a
multi-layered.
part of a part of grief too that points us to what's important to us as well. That's that notion of the growth, I guess, being embedded in that. Is it in part because it reminds us of what is important, whether it's, it doesn't have to have anything to do with death necessarily, but when we grieve the loss of something, perhaps it does point us towards something that matters to us, whether it's a value or anything else. Maybe that's part of that growth piece. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I know for me personally, that's why I've deliberately changed what I do in my business because I wanted to create space for this, what seems to be never ending loss, and to be there for mum and the rest of the family, and certainly for dad to give that more room in my life, which I think is going to be the biggest loss one of the big losses. And, my husband's parents are in their 80s as well. So, there are changes happening there and we're working with that. So, I don't know. I think for me, it's you're absolutely right. What matters most? Um, where's where's the loss coming from? The loss of what? And then what is the grief and the growth that comes from that? That's in some ways that's why I keep saying to myself often, what is this experience trying to teach me? What is this experience of dementia, which is one of the hardest losses that I've had to deal with? What is that trying to teach me, or what will that teach me? And I'm remaining curious and open to that. And in some ways, that's helping me manage my grief and deal with my grief, is being open to the light that I'm hopeful is there.
Mm.
And how often, like you said, the night light that might just be dim at times. Or does it get any brighter? I'm sure it does get brighter. I believe that it gets brighter. Yeah. So for me, that's
Mm.
how I'm trying to deal with the grief, is what is this experience trying to teach me? Mm.
And it sounds like that question leaves a lot of space for the grief to still exist, which I think is really important.
Mm. Yeah, I think so. Anyway,
Mm.
not that I'm a grief counsellor, but from my own personal experience. And maybe that's a form of the compassion that you spoke of earlier, Erica. Maybe that's all tied up in that. Maybe that's my way of being a bit more, compassionate with myself in dealing with the grief. Maybe.
Mm. Yes, and I want to add in a little something there that's just sprung to mind. This idea of, your own grief, perhaps opening compassion for yourself and also opening compassion for others. And I think that sometimes what can happen with grief, especially when we detach it from death as the only source of grief and loss, is that we can feel like we shouldn't be grieving the thing that we're grieving. So we sort of talked before about like, I should be over it by now, that notion. But I think that there's another piece to that that's like the loss isn't big enough or important enough or shared enough for it to be important. And I think that that's a real midlife thing that, I feel like I've got a lot of that to come probably. But those things that perhaps appear smaller on the surface, the loss of the sort of dominant role of mother, the loss of, how we used to look, our bodies changing, all of these sorts of things, to have compassion for ourselves that says, you know what, the fact that I am feeling a loss and experiencing grief is the thing that asks for my self-compassion. It doesn't ask for my judgment of saying, well, is this bad enough? Should I be feeling like this? Da, 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 da. It's like that whole notion of opening space for your grief. I think it's the same thing of going like acknowledging, yeah, I feel a loss for that part of me or that experience or that role or whatever. So I think it expands beyond, and maybe experiences with the kinds of loss that we're talking about, maybe even give us more compassion for those other experiences of loss that maybe would otherwise escape our attention. I don't know.
Yeah, and maybe that's what Claire Bidwell Smith was talking about in the beauty of grief.
Yeah,
Maybe
maybe.
that is the gift. That is the gift, is the
Mm,
compassion and then the light that shines and the growth with it.
mm,
I kind of
it's
like that.
beautiful.
Maybe that's a good place to leave it. What do you think?
I think so. I think so. I was just looking at my notes and I think we've covered everything that we hoped to talk about. I just want to thank the listeners for like hanging with us there, because this isn't an
Mm.
easy thing to talk about. And I don't think it's an easy thing to hear all the time either. So, thank you for being willing to be with us in this, because I think it's an important conversation to have. And yeah, thank you, Anita, for sharing with me as well.
Thanks, Erica. I feel exactly the same way. Thank you. I appreciate your vulnerability, your honesty, and your care and your kindness. And I know that as hard as this conversation has been to have, um, it's one that is important because I know it's one that is being asked for in my community as well, women around me. Yeah, particularly around the topic of dementia and the loss and the changes with that. It's quite prevalent. So, yeah, I hope that it has opened hearts and minds to grief and loss, and to know that it's not a one and done, that it's very much an individual experience and it's part of being human, and that let's look for the light.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anita.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone. See you next time. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for Midlife Unfiltered. If you loved this episode, you're going to love what's coming next. Be sure you're subscribed on your platform of choice so you don't miss a thing.
We'd also be delighted, and for sure do a little happy dance, if you took the time to leave us a rating and review. Those not only absolutely make our day, but more importantly, it helps other women who may be wanting something more from their midlife to know about us and to listen in as well. You can connect with us on socials too. You'll find links to connect on LinkedIn, Instagram, and email in the show notes.